Okay, I think we'll make a start. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, wherever you're joining from. Welcome to today's webinar, Leading Transnational Education Through Crisis. My name's Christian Rumble. I'm Head of Partnerships at Advance HE. We're delighted to bring together colleagues from across the sector, from across the global higher education community, to explore leadership, resilience, and institutional responses during periods of uncertainty and disruption. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you find the discussion insightful and relevant to your own context. Before we begin, just some housekeeping. We kindly ask you to keep webcams turned off and microphones muted, unless you're asked to share. This will help to reduce the background noise and chances of speakers being interrupted. The event's being recorded, and the recording of the session will be circulated after the event. Any questions for speakers can be posted in the Q&A section during the session, and this will be monitored by my colleagues Rebecca and Peace. Those attending the live event will receive a certificate of attendance, and this will be sent out next week, so week commencing the 29th of June. We've got quite a packed hour, so if there is time for questions at the end, we will take those, we'll field those. If there isn't, then contact details for myself and the speakers will be provided if you'd like to follow up. Just before we begin, I've noticed from the attendee list that there are some new names and new faces joining today. So I just wanted to provide a brief introduction to Advance HE. Advance HE is a member-led global higher education sector development agency, and we work within higher education to support providers around the world. Our purpose is to help higher education organisations be the best they can by unlocking the potential of their people and supporting positive institutional change. We work with institutions around the world across three key areas: leadership and governance, teaching and learning, and organisational culture. Our vision is to enhance the reputation and impact of higher education by supporting institutions to transform lives, enrich society, and contribute to economic development. And through our work, we help institutions navigate change, build capacity, and share effective practice across the sector. Our recent strategy launched for 2030 is shaped around delivering maximum impact for our members and partners. A key commitment that resonates strongly with today's webinar is our focus on convening and connecting colleagues to share global perspectives and experiences. Events such as this allow us to bring together expertise from different regions and contexts, creating opportunities to learn from the challenges and successes of others. And these 5 commitments shown here will be used to guide our work to 2030, ensuring we deliver what matters most. And we'll continue to listen and adapt to the evolving needs of our members. And we support the sector through a broad portfolio of services, including membership, charters, teaching and learning fellowships, accreditations, research and surveys, programs and events, and consultancy. And together, these activities help institutions enhance performance, develop their people, and strengthen the impact in higher education. So in a moment, I'm going to pass you over to our brilliant speakers. But before I do, I'd just like to introduce them and tell you a little bit about their experiences to set the scene. Faiza Qureshi is a transnational higher education specialist and academic leader with nearly 20 years of experience across the Middle East and South Asia. Her work focuses on the academic, operational, strategic, and quality assurance dimensions of transnational education. She's a discipline head for the postgraduate education portfolio and discovery units at Murdoch University in Dubai, where she's worked for over a decade, leading initiatives in teaching excellence, academic innovation, AI in higher education, and student success. Faiza chairs Murdoch Dubai Campus's Learning and Teaching Committee and Annual Learning and Teaching Conference, and serves on several academic and institutional boards across TNE higher education and the K-12 sector. Faiza is a Principal Fellow of Advance HE and Associate Editor of the Journal of Applied Learning and Teaching. Her teaching and research interests include transnational higher education quality, leadership and governance, AI and educational technology, assessments, and student and staff success. So welcome, Faiza. We're also joined by Professor Michael Gallimore, who is currently the Dean and Academic President of Murdoch University and has an extensive career spanning 30 years in both academic and industry sectors. Previous academic roles have included the head of DMU Dubai, Associate VP for Academic Affairs in Kuwait, College Director of a Teaching and Learning Institute in the UK, and Head of Engineering at a UK institution. Prior to his academic career, Michael spent several years working for Siemens Industrial Turbo Machinery, based in Lincoln in the UK, with various roles including design engineer, senior technical support engineer, and service manager. Michael is a chartered mechanical engineer, a member of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, and also a fellow of Advance HE, and he's been working in education since 2006. His research interests focus on the application of AI and machine learning methods for fault detection and diagnosis in transient dynamic systems, including industrial systems, personalized drug dosing, and treatment responses prediction. He's also carried out pedagogical research in student transition and support in engineering mathematics. If today's discussion prompts further questions or you'd like to explore how Advance HE can support your institution, please do contact me directly and I'd be very happy to continue the conversation and discuss any areas of shared interest. So today's webinar is a great example of that commitment to connecting members and partners around shared challenges and experiences. And we are fortunate to be joined by two highly experienced leaders in TNE who will now share their perspectives to leading through crisis, maintaining academic continuity and building institutional resilience. And so with that, it's my pleasure to hand over to speakers, Faiza and Professor Michael. Thank you.
So hello again, everyone. A warm welcome and thank you for joining our Advance HE webinar on TNE risk, continuity and decision-making and disruption today. Before we talk about risk, it's worth reminding ourselves why TNE matters. So over the past 2 decades, and anyone involved in transnational education would know that TNE has moved from the margins to the mainstream of institutional strategy for many universities. For some, TNE now plays a significant role in expanding educational opportunity, internationalizing their curricula, developing global competencies, strengthening international partnerships, enhancing institutional reputation, and supporting broader academic and strategic ambitions. Several issues have provided this push, including stricter immigration policies in home countries, for example. And all of this contributes to TNE becoming a more strategic priority for some universities now. So in other words, TNE is no longer a niche international activity. It has become a strategic institutional activity. Recent sector commentary from Higher Education Policy Institute also reminds us that TNE is increasingly discussed as part of institutional diversification and resilience, but it should not be treated as a quick financial fix. It takes time, investment, quality assurance, student support, and governance capacity to design and sustain well. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the changing TNE landscape. The environment in which TNE is operating currently has become more complex and more uncertain. Regional conflicts, geopolitical instabilities, regulatory divergence, travel disruptions, student mobility patterns, artificial intelligence, digital dependency, and institutional interdependence all create a new form of risk that institutions might be navigating in the TNE sector now. So my central argument today is simple. When TNE is disrupted by an event such as a conflict or a geopolitical instability, the issue is not only whether teaching can continue. The deeper issue is whether the institution can make timely, ethical, and defensible decisions across borders. This matters because TNE operates across multiple systems simultaneously. We've got stakeholders such as students, staff, regulators, partners, the awarding institutions, and they might be all located in different places, working with different information and experiencing different levels of risk. To help frame this discussion, I will draw on a small survey of TNE leaders and practitioners who have recently experienced operating under disruption. So I'm not presenting it as a sector benchmark because it's quite small. It is a directional leadership signal, and it does reveal an interesting pattern. Confidence in decision-making is often high when disruption goes on, while formal governance readiness is more uneven. So the purpose of this first half of the presentation is to explore a practical question. As TNE becomes more strategically important, how do institutions protect its benefits while making decisions that are timely, accountable, and defensible during periods of disruption? I will then hand over to Professor Mike Gallimore, who will bring these themes to life through a real institutional case study from Murdoch University in Dubai. So let's consider that as TNE matures, institutions operate across multiple systems, home and host country expectations, regulators, professional bodies, partners, students, and families who are sometimes in several countries. So a single decision, such as moving teaching online during disruption, can affect academic quality, student well-being, regulatory compliance, and institutional reputation at the same time. That is why governance becomes an enabling capability. It helps institutions make decisions that are timely, ethical, consistent, and defensible across borders. So the key question is not only can we continue delivery, it is who decides on what evidence and how do we justify that decision. So let's ground this discussion over using the short survey that we conducted. So it's a short survey pulse with TNE leaders and practitioners that we conducted. The survey asked about exposure to geopolitical and regional disruption, vulnerable areas, decision confidence, governance strictures, thresholds, continuity measures, and sector preparedness gaps. So we want to be precise about the evidence. The data set, like I said, is small. 17 respondents across 15 survey fields. The sample is Gulf heavy, and it includes different TNE models, branch campuses, franchises, and mixed TNE portfolios. The respondent group is useful because it combines senior, quality, operational, and academic perspectives. It included people involved in leadership, compliance, operations, student experience, academic delivery, and TNE support. So of the 17 respondents, 13 were direct decision makers, advisors, or operational implementers. So I'm not presenting this as a statistically representative sector benchmark. That would be a bit strong. What we're taking it as is as a leadership signal. The question behind the survey was simple. Are institutions as formally ready as they feel confident? And the answer is a bit mixed. Confidence is not low, but the formal structures behind that confidence are less consistent. So let's look at some of the highlights from the survey key findings. The first finding that we want to focus on is that disruption is no longer viewed as a low probability. In the survey, no respondent rated their exposure to geopolitical or regional disruption below 3 on a 1 to 5 scale. 7 out of 17 rated exposure as high or very high, and the mean exposure score was 3.6 out of 5. That tells us something important. For this group of TNE leaders and practitioners, disruption is not hypothetical. It is part of the live operating environment in TNE. The concerns they identified were familiar: regional conflict, travel and airspace disruption, regulatory uncertainty, and operation volatility. The leadership implication is that the issue is not whether disruption will occur. The issue is whether the institution has already agreed how it will interpret signals, escalate risk, and act proportionately. This is where TNE can be vulnerable. If every disruption has to be interpreted from scratch, the institution loses time at exactly the point when students and staff are looking for clarity. A mature response needs agreed signals, agreed escalation routes, and agreed decision thresholds before the incident begins. That will lead us to our second finding. The most exposed risk are humans. So this was quite interesting because the dominant vulnerability identified in the survey was student well-being and engagement. 15 out of 17 respondents selected it. Academic continuity came next with 10 out of 17, followed by communication coordination, and then tech and infrastructure. So this matters because it moves us from a narrow view of business continuity. Of course, platforms, systems, physical infrastructure matter, but respondents were primarily saying we're worried about people. We're not worried about buildings. We're worried about students, trust, engagement, confidence, learning continuity. So in a regional disruption, a student may be trying to understand whether it is safe to travel, whether teaching will continue, whether an exam will proceed, whether family members are affected, and whether the institution is giving them reliable information. They do not experience those as separate institutional categories. They experience one disruption. So the institutional response cannot separate welfare and academic continuity too neatly. During disruption, student well-being becomes part of academic continuity. If students are anxious, confused, unable to travel, or unsure whether the institution has a plan, their ability to learn will be affected. Before COVID-19, the emphasis might have been different, with institutions focusing first on tech, academic continuity, and financial risk. The survey now suggests that in the current environment, student well-being and engagement are now central to continuity planning. That leads us to the third key finding that we want to highlight, the readiness paradox. So operational capability appeared from the survey to be relatively strong. Respondents reported familiar continuity measures, online delivery, alternative assessments, hybrid teaching, student well-being support, emergency communications. That makes a lot of sense. Institutions have learned a great deal from recent disruptions, from the pandemic, and many have become capable of switching delivery modes quickly. But operational confidence is not the same as formal governance readiness. So 15 out of 17 respondents, they rated their confidence in timely, as ethical. They made sure that things were done properly, of course, and defensible decision making at 4 out of 5. But at the same time, what was interesting that only 5 of 17 reported having formal framework for assessing TNE-related disruption or conflict risk. Only 7 out of 17 reported formal thresholds for pausing, adapting, or suspending activity. This is the central tension that we're trying to get at. The survey does not show a lack of confidence. It shows confidence running ahead of formalized governance. That does not mean that institutions are acting irresponsibly. It may mean that they have experienced leaders, strong relationships, and good judgment. But in a high-pressure disruption, confidence is not the same as a controlled environment. So the next stage of TNE resilience is therefore not only operational continuity, but we are looking at governance structures. A mature model will balance local responsiveness, institutional consistency, regulatory obligations, and academic quality. So central leadership is not the problem. Senior leaders should be involved. The question is whether central leadership receives timely, structured, TNE-specific evidence, and whether local leaders have enough delegated authority to act. So this leads us to the governance gap. Now, this is a familiar TNE problem. The people closest to the issue often have the strongest situational awareness. A local campus or partner may know first that students are anxious, that travel routes are being affected, the families are calling, that staff is uncertain, or that the regulator guidance is shifting. But the formal authority to act may sit elsewhere, may sit with the home campus executive, academic governance, registry, legal risk, council level oversight. That separation is understandable. The home institution remains accountable for the award, standards, reputation, and regulatory obligations. But in a fast-moving disruption, distance between knowledge and authority can itself become a risk. So the survey gives us a useful signal here. 10 out of 17 respondents actually said major TNE risk decisions were made through central executive leadership. Only 4 out of 17 reported a dedicated TNE governance structure. So central leadership is not the issue here. Again, senior leaders should be involved. The question is, once again, whether they're receiving timely TNE information and whether there is autonomy available at the transnational campuses. To make this why is this a TNE issue? Specifically, anybody working in TNE would, of course, know that we're dealing with several stakeholders at the same time, multiple systems at the same time. There's the home campus governance, there's host country regulators, there are professional accrediting bodies, local partners, international students and families, and the institution that owns the award. So each of these stakeholders may see the same disruption through a different lens. A single incident can become several things at once: student safety issues, academic continuity, quality assurance, regulatory issues, staffing issues, partner issues, and a reputational issue. So this is why conventional crisis management models do not always translate neatly into TNE. Many models assume a single institution operating under one governance framework, but TNE, of course, really gives us that kind of simplicity. So the survey also reminds us that the operating model matters. The segmentation is a bit small, so I would not overstate it, but branch campus respondents reported higher confidence than franchise or other kind of TNE setups. And that is plausible because a branch campus may have more direct operational visibility and infrastructure and in comparison to others. So let's have a look at what we are suggesting today. To make this practical, we want to suggest 5 capabilities for TNE leaders working under disruption. So the first is sense. So institutions need to monitor right signals, security, travel, regulation, student well-being, attendance, staffing, infrastructure, and partner capability. But sensing is just not collecting information, it's interpreting what those signals mean in specific TNE context. The second is decide. This is where authority escalation routes and thresholds matter. Who can decide locally? What needs home campus approval? What level of change triggers a shift in delivery mode, an assessment change, a pause, or formal escalation? The third one is communicate. Communication is not just a message after the decision. In a disruption, communication is a control function. It reduces uncertainty, builds trust, and gives students, staff, and families a stable source of information. The fourth one we want to focus on is adapt. Institutions need the ability to modify delivery, assessment, attendance, expectations, and student support while protecting academic standards and regulatory obligations while maintaining academic continuity. The fifth is learn. After a disruption, the institution should not simply return to normal. It should update policy, delegation, evidence flows, systems, staff capability, and partner assurance. So the challenge is not simply continuing. The challenge is deciding when, why, and how to adapt. Now, looking at this a little bit practically, so what should institutions put in place before the next disruption? Across regulatory and quality assurance guidance, there is a consistent message. Define triggers. Institutions need clear adapt, pause, and suspend thresholds linked to student safety, academic continuity, host country regulatory requirements, awarding institutions obligations, and professional accreditation expectations, and of course around operational feasibility. Clarify decision rights. Who recommends the change? Who approves it? What can the local campus or partner do immediately? What must be escalated? Who informs the students, staff, partners, and regulators, the several stakeholders involved in transnational? The third one would be stress test continuity. A plan that has not been tested is only a document. So TNE providers should run realistic scenarios covering delivery, assessment integrity, staff availability, student support, partner dependency, and regulatory communication. The fourth one is treat communication as a control function. So in a crisis, silence amplifies risks. People need to know what is known, what is being monitored and has changed, and when the next update will come. The fifth one is learn and document. Defensible decisions need an evidence trail. So a practical next step is to run a regional disruption tabletop exercise. The purpose will be to test decision thresholds, evidence flows, delegated authority, and communication protocols before the next disruption occurs. So I'm going to close this half of our presentation by connecting this strategic framework to the case study that will be up next. The survey and framework point to a clear conclusion. TNE disruption is not only a problem of delivery, it is a problem of leadership, governance, and defensible judgment. As we move into Murdoch's case study, I will listen for 5 things. First, where did the strongest in situational awareness sit? So in many TNE disruptions, the local team sees the risk first and understands the student impact more clearly. Second, where did formal authority sit and how quickly could that authority move? That is the practical test of the governance gap. Third, when did student well-being become an academic continuity issue? This is critical because student anxiety, safety, attendance, assessment progression are connected during disruption. Fourth, which academic processes changed while academic standards were preserved? A mature response protects standards while adapting processes when there's a clear rationale. And fifth, what should be designed before the next disruption rather than improvised during it? So the value of the case study is that it takes these ideas out of the abstract and it shows what ethical evidence-informed TNE leadership looks like when conditions are moving quickly and information is incomplete and student and staff need clarity. So with that, I will invite Professor Michael Gallimore to take us through the Murdoch University Dubai TNE case study.
Great, thank you very much, Faiza, and thanks to Advance HE for inviting us to speak today. So I guess just to start with, part of my presentation is really just to bring some of those things that Faiza's talked about to life and speak from experience, having worked through a regional conflict over the last several months. So just for background context in terms of Murdoch University Dubai, we are an international branch campus, obviously based in Dubai, but we're part of a global network of campuses. Our main campus is in Perth in Australia, and we also have a campus in Singapore. So I think that's really important context, and many of the things that I will speak about are obviously relevant to branch campuses, but also there may be some relevance to other types of campuses, as Faiza mentioned. We have around 1,200 students. Our main campus has around 20,000+ students, so a much smaller operation, and made up of around about 50% international students, 50% domestic students. So as I'm sure you're aware, we've been working through a regional conflict over the last few months, which has been quite challenging. And hopefully through this part of the session, I could share some of my experiences of working through that conflict, and hopefully talk you through some of the things that went well, some of the things that we learned from, and hopefully that will be beneficial to all those people on the call. So of course, the nature of any conflict is you don't know what's happening from one day to the next. So there were periods of time where we needed to switch our approach and switch our operations and our delivery modes at very short notice, sometimes just a few hours notice. There were major travel disruptions, airspace closures, country-specific travel restrictions, and of course, changing government guidance, regulator guidance. So it was a very complex situation to navigate, and of course, it created some anxiety amongst students, staff, and of course, particularly for the international students, their families back home, who are anxious about their well-being on the ground here, and that drove quite a lot of the complexity and a lot of the decisions that we had to face. So next slide. So what I wanted to do really is focus, based on the survey results, focus on a few key areas and share, as I said, some experiences of around those key areas, of what worked well, what didn't work so well, and what really the experience taught us about leading a TNE, a branch campus or a TNE operation through that disruption, and hopefully that will provide some useful takeaways and guidance for other universities. Next slide. Okay, so I think the first thing to highlight is the situation was very complex. There were lots of decisions we had to take at very short notice. And of course, with any decision, there are many different ways to look at that particular issue. And that obviously then drives the decision that you take at the time. And I think one of the key things that we decided early on was what the primary drivers were behind those decisions. So focusing more on principles rather than getting into the detail of every single scenario, because then, you can get bogged down in those decision-making processes. So the first one, of course, was student well-being. So this was the first primary driver behind every decision that we made. So of course, the rapid escalation of the regional tensions led to a lot of anxiety, not just among students, but also their families, particularly the international students. There was a lot of conflicting and false information from many different sources that obviously added to that anxiety. Students, particularly international students, were concerned about their safety and whether they were able to travel and how that would impact their the continuity of learning. So in terms of actions that we took, I think the first important kind of lesson that we learned was communication was key, and having regular communication, being visible either on campus or online, visible through our different communication channels was really, really important to provide that that sense of stability and trust and confidence in the institution, and not just in the branch campus, but also back at the home campus as well. And of course, providing that reinforcement of well-being and counselling support on the ground, and also being able to adapt those offerings either through in-person or through online modes. Pfizer mentioned attendance. And of course, this was a big challenge, particularly for students that travelled during the conflict because of different time zones, because they were travelling. Some students had issues with connectivity based on the countries that they travelled to. So flexibility around attendance was really important. And what we did really was move away from attendance equaling engagement and looked at their broader engagement with the learning, because that was the primary thing that we were concerned about: are students engaging with learning rather than are they attending. We also found that students, they were looking for certainty in a very uncertain situation, which of course was quite difficult to provide. We took some decisions quite early on, particularly around our final examination period, which was still 7 or 8 weeks away at the time when the conflict started. But we decided very early on that we would move all of our exams online, regardless of the situation at the time, because we found that some students were faced with this dilemma between their well-being and their kind of sense of safety, particularly international students, and their academic continuity. So if they stayed, they could continue. If they left, then that would impact their overall learning continuity. So we thought it was important to remove that barrier or that dilemma for students. And as Pfizer mentioned, I think in terms of lessons learned, well, of course, well-being quickly becomes an academic continuity concern. So students aren't, they don't feel safe, or there's well-being issues, their attendance drops, and of course, then that creates continuity concerns. Value clear communication, even when there are no definitive answers. So they're not necessarily looking for a definitive answer to a particular issue. They just want to hear the institution. They want to know the issues that we're considering, even if we don't have specific answers at that point in time. And visibility of leadership, of course, provides that kind of reassurance during those times. But also, I think the visibility and how the institution presents itself is really, really important. If the university, whether that's the home campus or the branch campus, goes into kind of panic mode, then that panic kind of then translates to not just students, but also the staff. Next. So our second primary driver behind all of our decisions was, of course, academic continuity. So making sure that we could, of course, adapt to the situation at the time, maintaining our teaching and assessment schedules, either through online learning, by adapting our assessment methods where online wasn't appropriate, particularly for lab-based assessments where students needed access to specialist software or specialist facilities. But also recognizing that there needs to be flexibility, that academic standards and academic processes are not the same thing. Of course, you need to maintain the integrity of the curriculum and the academic standards, but the implementation of the curriculum and those standards can be different depending on the situation. Also responding to potential disruptions to attendance and campus access because of the ever-changing situation, which changed, in the early stages almost on a daily basis. Being able to be agile in terms of how we responded to those situations was really, really important. So in terms of actions that we took, and I think we've probably got COVID to thank for this. So that preparedness for the transition between different delivery modes, whether that was in person, online, or hybrid, that readiness was really, really important. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then, what are we actually trying to deliver? Are we fixed on delivering everything the same way that we're used to, or are we focusing more on the delivery of learning outcomes? Because of course that matters, and how you achieve those learning outcomes can be different, and not being too rigid in terms of those delivery modes. Clearly, got guidance to staff. I think was really, really important, maintaining those communication channels with staff, particularly through the periods where we were teaching online, and making sure that that messaging was consistent with the students. Otherwise, people tend to make their own decisions, and that's where you get issues with, obviously, with inconsistency. And then, as Faiza mentioned, the documentation of decisions and any academic concessions, so whether that was concessions around assessment to account for the fact that students were doing the assessment in different conditions, those documenting those decisions was really, really important. Next slide. So in terms of leadership and decision making, as I mentioned, students and staff to a certain extent are looking for that certainty amidst uncertainty. So being able to make decisions with incomplete information is obviously important, and deciding when to make those decisions and how to communicate those decisions, and particularly how to communicate those decisions across different stakeholders, whether that's staff, students, parents, regulators. Then those decisions, obviously, when to make them is really, really important. In terms of actions, the daily monitoring, of course, of the evolving situation. I think this is probably the most important point, which is about the establishment of clear decision-making and escalation processes. One of the big advantages of being a relatively small branch campus in comparison to the home campus is we have a lot more agility. As I'm sure those of you that work in branch campuses will appreciate that. Much larger universities are often a lot more difficult to kind of maneuver, and we lose some of that agility, but we need that agility to be able to make those quick decisions. So having clear decision making authority and escalation processes is really important, both through the standard operating model, but also considering whether that looks different during, you know, a phase where we've moved into kind of business continuity because of some kind of disruption, whether that's a conflict or something else. In terms of lessons, I think, you know, delaying decisions and remaining silent actually creates more uncertainty than imperfect decisions or information that is incomplete. So those regular communications with all those different stakeholders are really, really important. Clear delegation of authority, and I've worked in a number of branch campuses, and I know that this delegation of authority is different in different institutions. A lot of that authority is delegated to the branch in some cases. In other cases, it's more centralised. So having those clear frameworks in place in advance of any kind of disruption is really, really important, and having that trust and confidence to allow those, you know, the local leadership to have that autonomy to make those decisions as they emerge. Next slide. And this is something that Pfizer kind of alluded to, which is the gap between the branch campus, the reality on the ground, the local context, and the home campus kind of context. And sometimes there is a gap between those two elements. So of course, in terms of a branch campus, we're mainly concerned about what is the immediate impact on students, how do we navigate the issues, how do we maintain the student well-being and academic continuity. From a home campus perspective, of course, they're looking at that from a much higher level and looking at, okay, what is the risk associated with this situation, particularly around the governance and quality assurance. I think the perceptions between the two is very important, and that's what can often create or lead to that gap occurring. So of course, for us on the ground, the perception is often very different in terms of those risks, in terms of the issues, obviously in terms of the local kind of regulatory context, than it is to the external, whether that's the branch campus or other stakeholders. So having, even if decisions are escalated up to the home campus, having that local context is really, really important, particularly around, you know, managing the kind of the tone of the university in terms of how it wants to respond to the situation. Time zones is something that we often overlook, I think. You know, we're a campus in Dubai, main campus in Australia, 4-hour time difference that can create delays in decision making. And again, you know, another reason why some of that decision making needs to be considered, and where those decision making authorities sit is really, really important. Next slide. So obviously technology and infrastructure was a very, very important part of how we managed the situation, because that's how we adapted, particularly, you know, our teaching and learning through the whole conflict. Obviously a huge dependence on digital platforms. I think many institutions now, particularly in terms of teaching, are fairly well geared up to be able to adapt to online, particularly post-COVID. I think one of the biggest challenges for us was around assessment, and maintaining the integrity of assessment, and how we would manage that in an efficient way. So we used a platform called Respondus, which is an e-proctoring platform that uses AI based. So it monitors the students during the exams, and then provides flags where there are potential breaches, which wasn't without its challenges, because you then need a process to be able to triage those breaches that are generated. Some are genuine breaches, some are just flags because of some kind of procedural issue. So that was another, I think, learning point for us. It wasn't just about the technology itself, it's about the implementation and the consequences of using that technology. I think another key learning point for us in terms of technology was the readiness of staff to be able to engage with that technology. We kind of work on the assumption that everybody knows how to use, online delivery platforms and online e-proctoring systems, but actually the reality is that many don't, or they're not comfortable, pedagogically to deliver using those platforms in a quality way. So providing CPD workshops, localized support for those staff was a key, I think, learning point for us, and really important. Next slide. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'll speed through this one. So I think I've covered a lot of this, but of course, communication is often something that sits in the background. But actually, communication was, for us, I think, it became a core operational function. How we communicate, what we communicate, when we communicate, and to who we communicate. And the messaging that we use and the narrative that we use is really important, and how we adapt that messaging to different groups was really important. So we of course maintained those regular communication channels, made sure we had clarity on who was making those communications, so that we didn't end up with inconsistent messaging. But also considering all stakeholders. I think there's a danger that we focus on staff and students when actually, particularly in this situation, parents were a really big part, because they were the ones that were influencing the students on the ground. And again, it's that external perception, often generated by misinformation through social media, that then creates anxiety amongst the parents, and then creates more anxiety amongst the students, and then affects the kind of student well-being and academic continuity, which were, as I mentioned, are two kind of primary drivers behind everything that we did. Next slide. So just to wrap up, I think, in terms of lessons learned, the key highlights, of course, student well-being is academic continuity, as we've mentioned. We can't separate the two. So if we look after the well-being of students, we provide that safe space, we provide the support for students, we're flexible around things like attendance and their engagement, then that will ultimately enhance the academic continuity. Communication is, of course, key. It has to be at the forefront of everything that we do. It shouldn't just be something that sits in the background. We have the technology that provides the resilience, but it's the people that deliver it, and making sure that those people are well equipped to be able to use the technology, but also to be able to use that technology effectively. Academic standards and academic processes are not the same thing. I think this is one thing that we often get wrapped up on, that in order to maintain academic standards, we need to do everything the same way. So our academic delivery has to look exactly the same. We have to deliver the same assessments in the same format, but actually they're not the same thing. The academic quality and the academic standards are, they're fixed, but actually the implementation of those can change and should and will have to change particularly during a significant disruption. And then finally, the greatest risk, I think, is the gap that we spoke about, which is the gap between where the problem exists, the understanding of the local context, and where the authority to act resides. And if those two things sit in different places, or they're not well defined, and we don't have clear escalation thresholds and triggers, then that's where we lose the agility. That's where we end up with inconsistent decision making, and that's when ultimately we impact on student staff well-being and the academic continuity that I spoke about. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening. Sorry for overrunning slightly. Hope there was a few useful takeaways in there. But of course, we've put our email addresses on the final slide, so feel free to reach out to either of us at any point. And nice to see you all. Hand back to Christian.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Pfizer. I found that really interesting, and the message running through that is throughout all the chaos, you were able to bring some calm. It struck me what was really interesting is the relationship between your Murdoch Australia in Perth and the branch campus in Dubai, and I guess there'll be some learnings that come on the back of the work that you've done in terms of how that dynamic shifts in terms around that decision-making process. Just one question from me, and before we take questions from attendees. Looking back as we start, thankfully we start to return to normality. What's the one thing that you'll probably keep, that you introduced during the conflict? What's the one thing do you think you'll keep?
Okay. Very good question. I mean, I think there are multiple things that we learned through the process. The e-proctoring platform, I think, was a lifesaver for us. We'd actually introduced the software, the platform, some time ago, but we'd never really used it in anger at scale. Of course, it created a lot of challenges. But of course, with online exams, there's always that concern around academic integrity. I think as a platform, it functioned very, very well. It provided that flexibility. So as a business continuity option, that's something, there's work to do at the back end of that process in terms of how you then deal with all of the AI flags that it generates, etc. But as a platform, I think it worked well.
Yeah.
I don't know if from your perspective.
I would agree. I would second that, Mike.
Yeah, actually that leads me on to a question from Divyaba Gohil. I'm curious to know how integrity of online examination was maintained.
Yeah. And I think it's always a challenge. No exam, even an in-person exam, is never perfect. If students are intent on cheating, they will normally find a way to do that. So this particular platform is AI based. So of course, one of the biggest challenges I think around online examinations is if you adopt the human invigilator approach, which using traditional kind of platforms like Teams or Zoom, the only way you can really do that is if you split them into small groups. So of course, from a resourcing perspective, from an operational timetable perspective, it gets very, very complex. So that removed that issue because it monitors students on video. It will track if they look away from the screen for too long or if they're talking. It's not perfect, of course. It does generate quite a lot of triggers, and then you need to be able to triage those down into genuine, cases where there's evidence to support potential misconduct versus a student's just not quite followed the procedure, but there's no intent to cheat. Of course, it's not perfect. No system, whether that's face-to-face or online, is perfect anyway. But that's how we managed it. And I know that it's one of the things that many universities struggled with was maintaining that integrity. I know some institutions adapted their assessments away from formal examinations because they couldn't be assured that integrity was maintained.
If I may add here to that, with artificial intelligence, adaptation of assessments is something we have to do in any case. Academic integrity issues are on a rise with AI. So moving away from maybe in-person examinations to authentic assessments is definitely, whether conflict or not, or disruption or not, that's something we need to, as a sector, look into.
Yeah, very good. And another question from Helen. I'm interested in how you communicated with parents. I know you touched in this through your session, but if you could maybe go into a little bit more detail.
Yeah. So a number of different ways. Standard communications, obviously, via emails and things like that. But I think the most beneficial mode was we held a series of online webinars that were targeted at international students specifically and parents. So we invited both groups to that meeting, and because people will they'll get their perspective from the information around them, is what we found. So if that information is exaggerated or it's false, particularly when and again, it's that, what I was referring to, the internal versus the external perspective. And that applies across all stakeholders, including, I think, the home campus, where the information, unless there's those kind of regular, clear communication channels, and that's sometimes, I think, where the institution can kind of go into panic mode because they're not on the ground, they don't understand the local context. And the external perception looked a lot worse than the actual internal perception. So we found those regular webinars really built that trust and confidence, that we had control over the situation, that we were considering first and foremost the well-being of students, and that we were adapting our teaching and assessment to provide that academic continuity. That really helped, not just with existing students and parents, but also new students and parents.
Lovely. Well, I think that just about wraps up our session. It's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to hear your experiences in your case study, Michael and Pfizer. Advance HE will be developing through 26-27 a specific set of member benefits around transnational education, and I'm sure our chief exec Alistair has mentioned this to you, because I'm sure he'll be trying to encourage you to get involved in that. It's been really insightful. I hope everybody that's attended has enjoyed the session. I'll send you my virtual handshakes and round of applause for the session, and from the chat I can see, just to let people know, the recording will be sent out for those that turned up a little bit late, and there will be certificates of attendance. It just leaves me now to thank everyone for attending and to close the session and to wish you well for the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye for now.
Bye.